My name is Peter Cultus, and I am president of Muskingum County History. And our organization, I guess our official name, would be the Pioneer and Historical Society, where we started out. But about 8 years ago, we sort of DBA'd ourselves, Muskingum County History, one, to make it easier for people to remember the name, as well as to try to tell people more directly from our title what we are, what we do. We operate 2 museums, the Stone Academy, this building, as well as the Increase Matthews House, which is over on Washington, the corner of Washington and Woodlawn. Now, after the tour, you're more than welcome to go through the Matthews House, which will be open. The Matthews House was built in 1805. Dr. Increase Matthews was one of the 2 principal founders of Putnam. The other gentleman was Levi Whipple. Rufus Putnam was also involved in the founding, but I think he was probably more of a financial backer than an active participant. Whipple and Matthews laid out Putnam. And inside we do have a copy of the original plat map of Putnam, as well as the copy of the original plat map of Zanesville inside. Now, Putnam used to be called Springfield when it first founded, and the plat map has the village of Springfield on it. In about 1814, the name was changed to Putnam, one, because there was already a Springfield, Ohio, and 2, so they decided to change the name in honor of Rufus Putnam. Levi Whipple and Increase Matthews were nephews of Rufus Putnam. So that's a family connection there. This building was built in 1809. Now, you can see where the stone starts and the stucco stops and the stucco starts. The stone part is what was here in 1809. The stucco part, which was not stucco at the time, I'm not sure when they put the stucco over, but we have plans to remove it and go back to the original siding. The building itself became a private residence in 1838, and a man by the name of John Potwin from the New England area bought the place and made it into a private residence. And that's when the middle part was added. The garage part, the wood part that you see, would have been added probably around the turn of the 20th century. We're not sure exactly when the middle part or the garage was added. We have an approximate idea like I just gave you, but the exact dates we do not. The Stone Academy, as I said, was built in 1809. It was an attempt to have the state capitol temporarily located here in Putnam. It was competing against Zanesville. Zanesville and Putnam were 2 separate and distinct communities at the time. Now, the other thing, there were 2 other separate communities around where the Y Bridge is now, where the Licking River and the Muskingum River come together. On the Linden Avenue side of the Y Bridge was West Zanesville, and on the West Main Street side of the Y Bridge was an unincorporated village called Natchez. We had Putnam here, and the downtown was Zanesville. Zanesville ended up annexing all 3 of those places, 1872 to 1874, and then they became just a part of Zanesville, and that's what Zanesville is now today. In any event, this building was built in 1809. Putnam was not successful in getting the state capitol located here. I think John McIntyre was a better entrepreneur than Increase Matthews and Levi Whipple. John McIntyre also was involved in forming the state government. So he had better political connections as well. And he was able to get the state capitol temporarily located there for about 17 months between 1810 and 1812. So the capital started out in Chillicothe, was moved to Zanesville, was moved back to Chillicothe, and then in 1816, it was permanently moved to Columbus, where it is today. Now, Zanesville was never going to be the permanent capital, because prior to moving the capital from Chillicothe to here, the General Assembly had passed a law stating that the state capital must be located within 50 miles of the center of the state. Zanesville was not located within 50 miles of the center of the state. Columbus, which was called Franklinton at the time, but Columbus was, and hence that's how the state capital became located at Columbus. This building then sat vacant for a number of years. If you go inside or have gone inside, the downstairs was 2 rooms and the upstairs was 1 room. So you have to use your imagination. The 2 rooms downstairs was for the Ohio State Senate and the Ohio State House of Representatives. The upstairs was a combined chamber when they met together. So you can imagine how small the representation was. In fact, Muskingum County didn't become Muskingum County until about 1804 or thereabouts, a year after the state became a state. Muskingum County was Washington County. Washington County went up from the river north of Muskingum County and encompassed some of Coshocton County. So Washington County was large, and the state gradually whittled its way down, or the territory at one time. St. Clair was the governor of the territory until it became a state, whittled its way down to the counties where we are today. Muskingum County was formed from Washington County and a part of Fairfield County. In any event, the building stayed vacant and was used for school, was used for religious services, prayer meetings, general public meetings. It was an all-purpose building. But in 1835, it became a significant historical site. It was the location where the Ohio State Anti-Slavery Society was founded. From April 22nd to April 24th of 1835, 114 men met here from throughout the state of Ohio, as well as outside the state of Ohio, to form the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. It was the first state, it was a state organization for the abolition of slavery. Putnam, a couple of years earlier in 1833, had formed its own society, the Putnam I call it the Putnam Anti-Slavery Society. The name has about 3 other names to it, so I just remember it as the Putnam Anti-Slavery Society. But it started in 1833, and then the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1834, and then the Ohio State Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1835. But with Putnam and Zanesville being separate and distinct communities at the time, Putnam was founded by people from New England. If you get a chance to read David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, you will read about the history of the founding of Putnam, the founding of Marietta. Well, a continuation, what is it Paul Harvey said, now the rest of the story? The rest of the story has it coming up, the people from Marietta came up and founded Putnam for the most part. There are a lot of names, for example, in the Moxahala Cemetery that's not used anymore. You could not go 2 abreast. You had to go single file. It was cut by markings on a tree, tomahawk, for example. And they did follow like buffalo trails where they could, Indian paths, which were also made from buffalo trails. The Indians were relatively intelligent people because they let the buffalo cut down everything. And Ohio had a heck of a lot of buffalo. It was abundant in Ohio until they were slaughtered, much like in the West they were slaughtered and then brought back. So they followed this from just west of Wheeling in Belmont County, moved east through what is Cambridge and what is now Zanesville. In fact, the best record we have, they came down right by where the St. Nicholas Church is, down Main Street that way. And then went across, the Y Bridge was not there, so they had a ferry that went across the water, and then they went south towards Lancaster, Chillicothe, and ended up in Limestone, Kentucky. And that opened a trail from Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland, because there was roads from Maryland to Wheeling. So and people then came, and the Southerners were for the most part found at Zanesville. Well, Southerners had Southern sympathies for slavery. The Northerners, the Yankees from New England, did not. So when the convention was held here in April of 1835, the people from Zanesville, or at least some people from Zanesville, did not appreciate it much. They didn't like what was going on over here. And they disrupted the meeting, which started in March of 1835. There was a gentleman that was sent to travel throughout the state of Ohio by the name of Theodore Weld. Theodore Weld was a tremendous speaker. He was sent here by the American Anti-Slavery Society, and I don't think Theodore Weld gets enough credit for what he was able to do. But he toured the state of Ohio in 1835 as a representative for the American Anti-Slavery Society, giving anti-slavery speeches. And what he did is he went from town to town. He may go from Cincinnati to Circleville, to Springfield, to Lancaster, but he traversed the state. And he would not speak just one night. He would maybe speak 3, 4, 5 nights. And he may debate people in that community who were opposed to his views. And he wouldn't speak for an hour. He may speak for 3 or 4 hours at a time, and that was consistent. He eventually did lose his voice later on, but he continued his crusade. But in any event, he came here in March, I should say at the very last day, February 28th of 1835, was able to secure a room here to speak, and he gave his anti-slavery speeches for several weeks through the month of March. The people from Zanesville did not like that, and they came over and disrupted the meeting, breaking windows. There was a gate out front at one time, broke the gate, tried to break in to take Theodore Weld and tar and feather him, but were prevented from doing so by the attendees. Eventually, the people from Zanesville left, and Weld left the area for a couple of weeks to go elsewhere in Ohio, down to Marietta, for example. He came back, however, in April, and that's when the convention took place. And again, over those 3 days, April 22nd to the 24th of 1835, people from Zanesville did not like the meeting coming here, and so they again disrupted the actual meeting, the actual convention. Weld he was escorted from the building, from the history that we've uncovered, and taken to the home, at least on one evening, to the home of A.A. Guthrie. The A.A. Guthrie home still stands today, and we'll walk by it. It's a private residence today. There are 3 homes that still stand today from the abolitionist period. All 3 families at the time were very much either station masters or conductors, or both. A conductor was a person who took a runaway slave from point A to point B. A station master was a person who hid the runaway slaves in their house or at some other location. And then we had people who just were involved in the movement, petitioning Congress and trying to work as best they could to end slavery. In any event, the A. Guthrie House still stands today, the Horace Nye House still stands today, and the George Guthrie House still stands today, along with the Putnam Presbyterian Church, where we'll go next, and we'll go inside, and you're more than welcome to walk around the sanctuary and take pictures if you want. And I'll tell you about the history of the church when we're up there. In any event, the meeting ended, and people broke up. People then went their separate ways. But the 114 people that attended this convention, unfortunately, we do not know where they stayed. There was not any record of it. The violence, though, was very prevalent. There is a painter painted a picture of her rendition of her view of what the violence was. That's just inside the front door on the left wall as you come in. But the reports are they would burn a barn or two, because that's where the attendees would house their horse or horses, as the case may be. So they wanted to, I guess, kill the horses. They tried to tar and feather a very instrumental person, H.C. Howells, who lived in Putnam from 1832 to 1836, and who started the Putnam Anti-Slavery Society, and who probably, through attending the American Anti-Slavery Society, became friends with Theodore Weld and got Weld to come here. Because after the convention, Weld left the area, but then came back again for a month or two. And I believe he stayed with H.C. Howell, because they did write at least one letter together and send it on to one of the Tappan brothers, who were very much involved in the American Anti-Slavery Society. They were financing it. But H.C. Howells, the people who came over from Zanesville went to his house to locate him. They were going to tar and feather him, take him out forcefully. His wife answered the door, but the gentlemen from Zanesville, being proper gentlemen, would not harm a female. They were at least polite, or as polite as they could be, and she convinced him that he wasn't there. He wasn't there. In his writings, he said he was up a tree watching this all happen, so that violence didn't come to him. In any event, he came down, and his wife was so concerned about the violence, they left Zanesville or Putnam in 1836 and moved to Pennsylvania. So Putnam lost a very valuable person in H.C. Howells. But the most valuable people became the Guthrie brothers, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later. But the incredible thing about Putnam, Zanesville, and the like, you have to remember the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787. Marietta was founded in 1788. The Zanes Trace was started in 1796 and probably finished sometime after January 1st of 1797. It was supposed to be finished prior to January 1st of 1797, but in what we've been able to uncover, it probably wasn't, but it was sufficiently done enough where people did use it. So Ebenezer got paid, and his payment was 640 acres where the Muskingum and Licking River came together, and we have the October 1797 survey inside in the big meeting room that was laid out. He got 640 acres in Lancaster at the Hocking River, or at the time the Hocking, H-O-C-K-I-N-G, I guess a rendition of Mississippi, and then 640 acres where Chillicothe is located. And he ended up selling for $100 and probably gifting to John McIntyre and Jonathan Zane the 640 acres here at the Licking and Muskingum River as a thank you for helping him do the trace. And so Zanesville was sort of started, had an idea in 1797. John McIntyre and Jonathan Zane then, a year and a half later, started to lay out Zanesville, platted out. The records are, when John McIntyre actually came to Zanesville, There's 1790, 1799, 1800, and 1801. So likely with everything, it occurred probably about 1798, 1799 in that time period. The plat map was laid out. It was recorded, it wasn't recorded until 1802, but that's how Zanesville, which at one time the name was Westbourne, which never caught on. The plat map has Zanesville. It was also referred to as Zanestown, but Zanesville is what it was called, although there were a couple other names floated about. And so that started, let's just call it 1800. So in 12 years, you had Marietta and now Zanesville laid out, and then in 1803, Zanesville, or Ohio, is named a state. In 1804, Muskingum County is Muskingum County, and Zanesville is the county seat. So all this happened extremely quick, extremely fast. I mean, it was like that. And the reason for all that is because there was no more Indian tribes in the area. The Indians, the tribes here were the in the state of Ohio were the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Wyandot, the Mingo, which was a branch of the Seneca tribe, Miami, and there were some Ottawas up in northwest Ohio. But once the Battle of Fallen Timbers was fought up in northwest Ohio, where General Matt Anthony Wayne defeated the tribes, that moved all the tribes northwest of this area. There was a Wyandot reservation in northwest Ohio, but the fear of Indian attacks, which existed a great deal, and if you want to read a history, go back and read the old histories of the Ohio Indian tribes and the white man that came into this area. We watch the Westerns today and see the Indians and the armies fight and the battles. Those battles pale in comparison to what happened here. What happened in Ohio and the Northwest Territory were some of the most violent, vulgar, just terrible. I mean, we had 96 Indians massacred at Gannett Hutton, which is up in Tuscarawas County. The Big Bottom Massacre, which is in Morgan County, when people were coming up from Marietta in about 1789, 1790, Indians attacked a very, very small set of homes and killed about 8 people there. So the massacres occurred on each side, and they became more and more violent. And the worst one was probably William Crawford, who was a close friend of George Washington, when he was captured by the up in Sandusky area. He was tied to a pole, a leather tether, maybe 6 feet in length around his ankle. Then for, I don't know, 14 hours, the Indians would take their black powder, load it into their musket, would not put a lead in it at all, but then fire the black powder into his body. So he gradually turned black. They would hit him like running a gauntlet, and they eventually burned him at the stake. So the actual description is quite specific and quite violent. So what you see happening in the West, I guess the massacre of the Sioux at Wounded Knee would be the closest thing that would be here, and what is here happened more often than not than the massacre. Like the Wounded Knee was terrible, but it wasn't a continuing event. Here, from the French and Indian War down to the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, it happened a lot. You could use both hands to count it on. But once the Indians were cleared out, then this area filled up. And as Ohio became more and more of a state, Zanesville grew more. The National Road went through Zanesville in 1828. In 1804, the state legislature passed a law that from land sales, roads were going to be built. It was for a road building tax. And it's not like the ODOT today where you have an organized entity doing these roads. When these roads were built, everybody seemed to build roads. So when we talk about the Zane Trace, particularly going through Muskingum County, the Zane Trace moved. You may have a road from Zanes Road to Wheeling, road to Zanesville. You may have three or four different roads marked that could be the Zanes Trace. And the only way we put it together is when we did our history, there were diaries that were done in the early 19th century between 1800 and 1812. And the gentlemen talked about stopping at bars, at taverns on the trace. And so we located where they were and put together where the Zane Trace went. So that was that. But once the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society was founded, it took off, and Putnam became a center, a major center of the Underground Railroad movement, which we'll discuss more when we get into the Putnam Presbyterian Church. So let's walk.
In 1843, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Douglass spoke here. We're pretty certain it's 1843, based upon a couple things we've been able to uncover. One, there was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Gray, who was an Underground Railroad individual conductor. And he wrote that he had met Frederick Douglass on a trail, and referred Frederick Douglass to A.A. Guthrie when Douglass told Gray that he wanted a place to speak and didn't have a place. So that's why Gray directed him to A.A. Guthrie. That was in 1843. Guthrie, as I said, was one of the first three elders of this church, so that's very believable. Confirmation of that, confirmation of that came in 1858. A gentleman by the name of Robert Wallace, who's a professor at Western Kentucky University, in coordination with a couple of gentlemen over at IUPUI, that is Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. But they uncovered an article that Douglass wrote in his newspaper and of his travels through Zanesville in 1858, where he referred back to when he was here 15 years earlier. So 1858 minus 15 is 1843. And he stated that the Zanesville of 1858 was much, much better than the Zanesville of 1843 when he was here at that time. He also, in that newspaper article, referred to Nelson Gant as an incredible individual, sung Gant's praises greatly as an entrepreneur and somebody who came from slavery, was freed by his master in his master's will, and really, really, really made a name for himself, owning a coal mine, salt lick, as well as he was a fruit grower, quite an entrepreneur, and became very successful. In fact, one of the things about Gant that is amazing, at least to me, is in 1905, when he died, the local paper published his will in the paper. And that's ordinarily not done for anybody, at least that I've been able to find. In any event, Douglass spoke here in 1843. Douglass was back in Putnam in 1850. He spoke at the Methodist Church here in Putnam, It's not the Methodist church that we know today. The Methodist church at which he spoke is no longer standing. He was through Zanesville again in 1858, and he was through Zanesville again in 1866 when he was at the Gant farm and gave a talk, and also talked that evening at the Nevitt House, which no longer stands in Zanesville. The Nevitt House was a meeting house. Reading the history of Nevitt House or Nevitt Hall is mentioned frequently in the old newspapers. So it looks like it was, don't have a picture of it, not been able to find one yet, but it looks just like a meeting hall for people. So that Douglas was here through Zanesville at least 4 times. In 1850, the interesting thing is, Douglas was in Columbus. He purchased the ticket to take the stage from Columbus to Zanesville. When he got to anybody here old enough to remember the Neal House in Columbus? Oh God, I'm getting too old. The Neal House was a big hotel, very nice hotel. It's where the Huntington Bank building now stands on Capitol Square. But when he got to the Neal House, he was asked to vacate the stagecoach, inside the stagecoach. They wouldn't let him ride in the stagecoach, even though he had a first-class ticket. He had to ride on top or not at all because he was black. Douglas insisted, and there was room inside too. Douglas insisted that he had a first-class ticket, but it didn't make a difference. So he was kicked off the stage. Eventually did get a way to Zanesville on another stage. However, Douglas then sued the stagecoach company. There was a complaint, Frederick Douglass versus the Ohio Stagecoach Company. It did not go to trial. There was a settlement. The stagecoach company ended up settling with Frederick Douglass by paying him $13. And so that settled that case. But the thing about Douglass is, particularly in his 1858 article, he stressed how critically important education is. He was a staunch believer in reading and writing and the ability to communicate and education. There was another black man in Zanesville by the name of J.C. McSimpson. J.C. McSimpson was born into poverty. In fact, when he was a young child, his mother had to give him up, indentured him to another family. He eventually grew up. He learned to read and write at age 20. He walked from Morgan County to Oberlin, 120 miles, according to his autobiography. Got his education at the Oberlin Academy, which no longer exists. Oberlin Academy was the preparatory school for people to get into Oberlin. Got his education there, married a Zanesville woman in 1847, and then came back to Zanesville and wrote a book of ballads, anti-slavery ballads. Quite impressive individual throughout his life. And he too stressed the importance of education. He wrote articles for the Clarion newspaper, which was out of Cambridge, then New Concord, and he was a black leader in the Union Baptist Church, and he eventually then died in the 1870s. But he and Frederick Douglass came from different backgrounds, but each came to the conclusion that education was absolutely critical if the black man or any man is to succeed. Any woman is to succeed in life. And Douglass even stressed how important teachers are and how they should not be harangued or criticized or for trying to teach their children to read and write. But anyway, in 1839, the convention came back to Putnam and was here at this church. Addison Kingsbury was the minister at the time, although William Beecher was the chairperson of the organization. People from Zanesville, again, did not like the convention being held here, so they got a group of people and were coming to disrupt the convention, much like they disrupted the convention in 1835. In fact, if you do take a walk through the Stone Academy, inside the front door to the left on the wall is an artist's rendition of the violence that took place at the Stone Academy in 1835. But here, the people from Putnam said, no way, no how, and they met the group from Zanesville coming over on the 3rd Street Bridge. So there was a standoff on the 3rd Street Bridge. Now the 3rd Street Bridge, if you're at where the city jail is, as 3rd Street dead ends, at the city jail there is a guardrail. The 3rd Street Bridge went from that guardrail, and if you look sort of diagonally across the river, it ran right into the side of where the train trestle leaves the bank at Putnam. So it was right next to the train trestle. So it's somewhat at a diagonal going across the river. They met, and there's about 3 or 4 different histories of what took place. But some type of confrontation took place. How violent it was, we don't know. It depends on who you want to believe in reading. In any event, the people from Putnam fought off the people from Zanesville and succeeded in preventing the people from Zanesville from coming over. As well, the people from Putnam may have had help from the sheriff at the time. People don't mean to insult him, but you look old enough, when you were growing up, or with your own kids, have you ever read the Kids the Riot Act? Okay, well that's an actual law. In fact, the law itself came over from England, and the report is that the sheriff, when he arrived, what he does, or did, is take out a piece of paper and reads, gives the people 30 minutes to 45 minutes to disperse, and if they disperse, fine. If they don't, they're arrested, but the sheriff read them the Riot Act. Hence, that's how the saying started, reading the Riot Act. Of course, my mom never read me the Riot Act growing up, but that's beside the point. But in any event, this church has been involved with the Underground Railroad and the people who attended here through the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. The Underground Railroad eventually died out with the Civil War. The Underground Railroad eventually extinguished itself because once the Civil War started, runaway slaves did not have to come north for the most part, although some probably still did. They would attach themselves to the Union Army. For example, when Sherman made his march to the sea, they followed the Army. Or when Grant was over in the Western Theater, winning Nashville and Vicksburg and the other battle, Fort Donelson, they would attach themselves to Grant's army. And so that's how they moved. And it was a safer route because they didn't have to go it on their own. Because the thing about the runaway slaves, they came north. They didn't have help getting here. They had help once they got here, but they didn't have help removing themselves from their master. Other than someone like a Harriet Tubman who actually went south, but she was over in the Maryland, Delaware, East Coast. She was in the Maryland area where she actually went south and brought her family back, her family members back, and other slaves that wanted to escape. She's one of the few people, conductors that actually went south that we know of. There are others. There was a gentleman in Morgan County by the name of Cheadle that did that, but it was more of an exception to the rule as opposed to the rule itself. And the thing about Harriet Tubman that I admire about her most and is one person in history I'd love to meet. Not only was she a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but then during the Civil War, she became a spy. And the crazy part about it, the slave owners offered a reward for Harriet Tubman. I've seen a poster as high as about $40,000 at the time. They were after her. But she was a spy too, so they had no idea who she was when she was a spy. They didn't, it's ironic that she could be so effective as a conductor and as a spy, and they not even really know who she is. The thing about her organization, when she went south, she would remove slaves on a Saturday because the masters went to church on Sunday. So no one would know the slaves have left until Monday. Secondly, she then had usually a child, boy or girl, follow when the posters were put up that the runaway slaves, who they were. The child would follow the person posting the posters and then take the poster down. So they had a head start. She would also carry what amounted to laudanum in a pistol. The laudanum, I don't think it was laudanum, but it was something that would make the infant sleep so the infant wouldn't cry and give their positions away. And the pistol was not necessarily for shooting at the slave catchers, but if a runaway got cold feet and wanted to return because they didn't want to leave, she may shoot them because she didn't want that person to tell where they were going or how they were getting there. So she was a tough old woman, and she was something else. In fact, as an aside, Muskegon County History, we're having our third annual Underground Railroad Symposium at the library on October 1st. And one of the presenters we're having is a woman from Thompson, West Virginia, who is an artistic director for a group that does historical reenactments. And she is coming up from West Virginia to reenact and to tell us about Harriet Tubman. So if that's something that you find interesting, October 1st, it will be on our website in the near future, as well as the library's website in the near future. But in any event, this was, the main route at the time was Woodlawn Avenue. So when they went down Woodlawn, they met them on the bridge, stopped them on the bridge, and prevented them from coming over. So what we're going to do, one, what questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
So this is, goes to what you talked about, the slaves getting to the Underground Railroad. How did they know where to go? Because you could just walk into...
Yeah, they're usually the Negro network, the Black network, generally word of mouth would tell them where to go. There were people like Frederick Douglass. He was a slave, but he had free reign to go where he wanted to go by his master. So he had a lot of people he had talked to through his work for his master. His master might rent him out, and he may go do whatever he did for somebody else. So there was a network within the Black community of, you know, this is the person you want to see, or this is where you want to go, and that type of thing. And then the network itself, the conductor generally would go from point A to point B, but that point A would not go to point C because he or she did not necessarily know where point C was. So it was A to B, B to C, C to D, because there was usually nothing written down about the system because they didn't want that information to fall into slave catchers' hands. There is a recent biography, I think published last year, on a man by the name of William Still, S-T-I-L-L. It's on Amazon. And William Still was an abolitionist, was a black man in Philadelphia that ran the network in Philadelphia to New York. And he did write things down. So if you're interested in more detailed information, that biography on William Still may be a place to look. Fascinating person. And they did a lot of different things. He was the person that received, what was it? Not Boxcar Willie. Oh, I can think of. There was a gentleman, a black man, who escaped slave by putting himself in a shipping container and shipping himself to Philadelphia. And he got there in the shipping container and he was released. But that's how he escaped from slavery, by being shipped in a shipping container. You see these big boxes that they use the crowbar to open it up, and that's how he got out. So, and I can't remember the guy.
Henry Box Brown.
Yes, Henry Box Brown, thank you. And that's how he got out. But the thing about the runaway, they sought freedom, and that's what they wanted. They didn't worry about what happened to them or what was going to happen to them when they got to where they were going to go, but they wanted to get there nonetheless. There is a report that there was a runaway slave working in, I believe it was Chicago, at a hotel. And there were gentlemen he was serving. He was a waiter at a hotel. And they were talking about slavery and runaway. And they asked him, because they knew he had been a slave. And they asked him, well, did your master mistreat you? And he said, no. Did he beat you at all? No. Did he starve you? No. Did you have a place to sleep and live? Yeah. Then why did you want to leave? And the report is the gentleman looked at the guy asking him all these questions and said, well, sir, if you want to apply for the job, I believe it's still open. And that ended that conversation. But that's the feeling. But this church was an integral part of